Okay, so in the last couple of episodes, we discussed some of the issues on the atheist side and some of the issues on the theist side. Atheists would understand the complications with the scientific methodology if there was some kind of supernatural interference, but because they see that as highly, they see the existence of the supernatural as highly improbable, they dismiss that whole question. While theists already believe in God, but because they're dualistic in their metaphysics, they don't seem to fully understand the implications for the scientific methodology. They don't stop to think that the logic of science was devised within a world that is not dualistic, and the implications, the way scientists go about doing their science, assumes that the world isn't dualistic, and they don't stop to think about the implications of that. So in this episode, I want to just take the time and kind of go through the scientific method and point out where the issues might exist, and then we can discuss what we can do about it. Okay, so what I want to start with is basically describe kind of a scientist ideal situation. If everything was exactly as planned when doing science. So this can apply to any kind of experiment, but let's just say we're trying to figure out whether some kind of new medication is effective or not. So the things we want to do, of course, is we want a large sample size. So we want thousands of people, tens of thousands of people if possible, get as many people to participate in the trials as we can. The next thing is we want to have a control group. So we take the participants and we divide them into two different groups. And one group gets the medication and the other group gets the placebo or the sugar pill, the fake pill. Now, as great as that is already, because you're looking to see if there's a difference between the actual medicine and just people just taking a pill and thinking they're getting better. You also want to make the experiment double blind. So that means you don't want the individuals taking the pills to know if they're taking the pill or the placebo. And you don't even want the people administering the medicine to know, because they might give some indication that they're giving the patient the fake pill, and that will affect their healing. And then you want to make this whole thing random. So put it into a computer and let the computer randomize your samples, so that way nobody exactly knows, except the scientists kind of overseeing the process. Nobody really knows who's getting what, and it's not assigned. There isn't an accidental bias in who gets what kind of pill. Of course, once you do the experiments, you collect very careful data. You measure everything, you get the results, and you keep track of the results very carefully. You run your data through statistical analysis to make sure that there's a statistically significant difference between the group taking the real medicine and the group taking the placebo. Just because there's a little bit of improvement doesn't mean that this is statistically significant. And then once you get that far, and let's say your results are good and you think, okay, this is actually working, you want other people to reproduce your results. So give the whole experiment to another group of scientists somewhere else and have them try it out and see if they can reproduce your results. And finally, you want to have everything published in a peer-reviewed publication, so that other scientists in the future can study your results and comment on them and let those results inform future studies and so on. So there's this very elaborate process that scientists go to in situations where it's possible, because it's not always possible to get everything perfect, but as much as they can, they try to create this ideal experimental conditions so that they can actually be confident in the results. So if we were to plot things on a graph like this, imagine, let's just apply this graph to the sample size. So we said that what we want when we do an experiment is to have a large sample size. Well, let's say we start with a very small number, like one person, that's clearly not a good sample size. And then we increase the sample size to, 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 10,000, and so on. As we increase our sample size and get the results, the more the sample size gets increased, we kind of go through a stage where there's relative uncertainty because we don't have enough data yet. And then we get to a stage, and maybe this thing should have been a little bit, this middle area should have been a little bit bigger, where it seems like the experiment is working, and we could probably start developing some confidence that the medication is actually effective. But then if the sample size increases quite a bit more, and we do this over years and years, and we get really good results, then we enter an area of relative certainty where things are, improving more and more. We never get 100% certainty in science. So this graph kind of goes higher and higher, always getting closer to this 100% mark, but never quite getting there. So because in science, there's always the tiniest possibility that maybe something didn't quite go right. And so we always leave that open. But in pretty much anything in science, things go through this sort of cycle from relative uncertainty to a kind of a working certainty, and then to relative certainty because it's been tested for a long time and it seems to be consistent in its results. All right, so now can science or methodological naturalism be applied to the supernatural? Because if you look at the label, methodological naturalism, you might say, well, because it's naturalism, it's intrinsically incompatible with the supernatural. And the answer is no. Methodological naturalism can actually be applied to a supernatural situation. So the go-to experiment the go-to example is the prayer experiments, where people do intercessory prayer, and then there's experiments are being done to see if they work. But this can be applied to anything. Like, for example, let's say there's some kind of a statute of a saint that starts crying or something, or there's somebody that is able to go around and heal people miraculously, or any kind of imaginable miracle. If we can subject it to experimental conditions, we can test it out regardless of the fact that it's supernatural and science is supposed to only deal with the natural, because we can actually test the results. So for example, coming back to the prayer experiment, if let's say we get a large enough sample size, so we get groups of people that are praying, and then we get thousands of people that are sick and in the hospitals, or have some kind of problem. And then we follow the process. We do a control group. Some people are being prayed for, some people aren't. We have a placebo effect where we tell people that everybody's being prayed for, or something like that. And then the double blind, where nobody really knows who's praying for who, or there's some way to kind of keep track of this, so experimenters cannot affect the results. We introduce the same randomness that we would with the medication trial. We collect the data, we apply a statistical analysis to it, and we try to reproduce it. So essentially everything that we've mentioned in the previous slide regarding any kind of normal experiment, whether it's medication or something else, it could also be applied to something that's supernatural. So the capacity of intercessory prayer to have some kind of impact on the natural world can be subjected to experimental conditions and tested out. And in fact, it has been done, and some people claim it's succeeded, and others claim it failed. But really, if it had been subjected to numerous trials and actually succeeded in some way, it would change a lot. So clearly, it hasn't succeeded to the degree that people claim it has. But anyway, the point is that there's nothing intrinsically incompatible between supernatural claims and methodological naturalism, because the process can test the results of the claims on the natural world and not the claims themselves. Okay, but then, even though that is the case, and even though MN, methodological naturalism, can consider supernatural claims, there are situations in science that are less than ideal. So we've looked at the ideal experimental conditions, but now let's think about situations that aren't as ideal. For example, sample size. You cannot always get the sample size you want. You want hundreds, thousands of people, as many people as possible. But let's say you're trying to heal a disease that's extremely rare and only a handful of people in the world get it at a time. So your sample size might be too small to really get the results you want. Let's say you want to have a placebo and have a double-blind experiment, but for whatever reason, the medication you're giving people has really bad side effects that cannot be duplicated. So immediately everybody knows who's got the pill and who's got the sugar pill. So the double-blind element of the study is affected. Reproducibility. What if you're working with something and it's very hard to reproduce because it doesn't happen when you want it to happen? You're studying a phenomenon that is random, or it happens very rarely, and it's hard to reproduce to test it out. There's ethical issues. You don't want to study on humans. You don't want to study on animals like chimps or animals that are very close to humans in a sense, and there's ethical implications. So that sometimes gets in the way of the scientific study. There's the aspect of human agency. So people have free will, and some people might not want to subject themselves to the experiment. So you would say, hey, I want to go and study this particular thing, but nobody wants to participate and go along with it. Sometimes the evidence is destroyed. So something happens, and then either through natural forces or through intentional means, whatever evidence that phenomenon left behind is destroyed, and you cannot really study it. Sometimes things are too small and we have no access to it. We don't have the equipment to study it because they're too small for anything that we have available. Things are too far away and we cannot gain access to it, outside of maybe the observable universe or something like that. And other times there's things that happen that are really far in the past, so it's very hard for us to find a way to access it because it's been so long ago. So all of these things and many others are situations that make the scientific process less than ideal, and it is not always possible to apply those experimental conditions to something and then study it in such a way so that we can get high enough on that confidence scale to say, yeah, this definitely is correct or this definitely is wrong. So this is just an inherent limitation of the scientific process that applies to everything, not just issues of the supernatural. However, a lot of times when it comes to the supernatural, those issues are multiplied. In other words, it's even more difficult if you're having less than ideal conditions. It's even more difficult to deal with something that's supernatural than it is to deal with something natural. So to explain what I mean by this, consider the possibility of an ideal resurrection. And the reason I'm using this example is because a lot of Christian apologists rely on the resurrection of Christ as evidence for Christianity. So if you follow debates between Christians and atheists, there's a certain lineup of arguments, and the lineup goes something like this. They start with the generic God, and they say, okay, the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the design argument, the ontological argument, and a few things like that. So there's 3 or 4 main arguments that apologists use for the existence of God. And then they say, okay, that's just the existence of God, and now I'm going to prove Christianity. And when they get to Christianity, they introduce the argument from the resurrection of Christ. But the resurrection of Christ is less than ideal because of many situations. I mean, only a few people saw him, and it happened thousands of years ago, and a whole lot of other things like that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, okay, what if we had a much more ideal resurrection? And of course, this is a hypothetical situation, and we're just going to assume that this actually happened. just to consider the implications for science if something like this actually happened. So instead of going back 2,000 years, let's go back only 1,000 years. And instead of having, a resurrection happen where hardly anybody really saw it except some soldiers that some Roman soldiers that denied the whole thing happened, and a few of Jesus's followers. No, let's have a resurrection that happened in a very public setting. So let's just say this happened in the Colosseum, where there's like thousands and thousands of people sitting there watching the games, and then somebody is killed, and then they come back to life in front of everybody, so like everybody could witness it. There's thousands of witnesses involved. And instead of having a crucifixion, let's have a decapitation, because then you cannot say maybe they didn't actually die. So this is clearly something that happened. The person is really dead, and let's just say they were decapitated, and they sat there decapitated for several hours, and everybody saw it, and then the resurrection happened. And let's just say that in the audience, it's not just a few fishermen and shepherds and other uneducated people, but it's people from many different countries. They're highly educated, they're highly influential, and they kept meticulous records of the resurrection, and they went back to their respective countries, and those records are kept in very pristine condition. And today, 1,000 years later, archaeologists and historians have gone back and discovered these records of this ideal resurrection all over the place in many different places. So what then? What will scientists do with that? Well, will they admit the fact that a resurrection happened? And the answer is they won't, because there's other simpler explanations. Like, for example, they'll say maybe there was some kind of mass hypnosis. The idea of a mass hypnosis is highly unlikely, but it's not as unlikely as a resurrection. Maybe there's substance abuse, they were drugged, they were drunk or something, and they all thought something happened that didn't happen. Maybe there were twins involved, so somebody played a trick on them. They killed some people, and then they brought their twins out and said they were resurrected. Or maybe, which is probably the most plausible, is that all these people manipulated the record. So somebody got paid to go and plant records of this thing in different places throughout the different countries of that area. And we discovered the records with the story, and we think, oh, wow, this is a legitimate record of something that happened, when in fact the whole thing was manipulated. All those are possibilities that are intrinsically more plausible than a resurrection, even if the resurrection actually happened. So from a scientific perspective, there's nothing that can happen 1,000 years ago that would prove to people today that the resurrection actually took place, unless the evidence went overboard. So like somebody goes back in time and takes the video of it or something to that effect, which is not possible. So there are clear limitations of the scientific methodology to deal with something supernatural, even if it did occur, because of the rationale of how science works. Okay, so how do scientists work with things that happen in the past? They cannot take things that occurred, hundreds, thousands of years ago and put them into experimental conditions to see how they actually happen, because they've already happened. And the way they work with it is by basically coming up with some kind of hypothesis and letting that hypothesis make predictions, and then testing those predictions to see if they actually occurred, and evaluating things on that basis. So the hypothesis makes predictions, the predictions create a basis for experiments, and then the experiments can either confirm or reject or deny the validity of the hypothesis. All of this is always done using natural assumptions, because it's the only way that we can actually do the process. Okay, I wanted to make sure that I have everything here. So here's an analogy. Imagine you're driving your car down the road, and this is a road you drive on every day to go to work. Maybe, so you're familiar with the situation. And as you're driving, you see a boulder or a pile of rocks that are just sitting there in the middle of the road. So you stop your car and you say, okay, I wonder what happened here. Where did this come from? So you can come up with a hypothesis, and your hypothesis can be, well, there's some hills or mountains nearby. Maybe a rock from the top of the mountain broke away and it rolled down and it came down the hill, down the mountain, and it stopped right in the middle of the road here. Now, that is your hypothesis. But the hypothesis makes testable predictions because there's certain things that should be there if, in fact, this is what happened. If this boulder broke down from somewhere higher up on the hill and it rolled down the hill all the way to the middle of the road, then you should be able to see evidence of that in the ground. You know, the vegetation has been damaged. There's strips or, you know, there's the ground itself has been damaged somewhere. If you climb up high enough on the hill or the mountain, you see that there's evidence that a rock broke away from something. So your hypothesis makes predictions, and you can go and verify those predictions to see if they're true. But you can only do this if your hypothesis is natural. And the reason is because you actually understand how something natural works. Like, for example, if you made the hypothesis that, you know, an angel or God or some kind of supernatural entity decided to create this boulder in the middle of the road ex nihilo, or if there's some other kind of supernatural situation here, you have no idea how, assuming that supernatural is available or exists, you have no idea how that works because you only know how the natural, how things happen in the natural world. And you cannot make any hypothesis on how that happens, and you cannot make any, or if that is your hypothesis, you cannot make any testable predictions based on the hypothesis. And all you could do is just say, okay, maybe that's what happened. But the reason scientists follow this process of methodological naturalism is because they don't have a choice. It's not necessarily that they reject the supernatural, is that the only thing we understand is the natural world. The natural world follows certain rules and principles, certain laws. And because of that, when we come up with a hypothesis, we can actually make predictions, and we can study those predictions and come up to some conclusion. So we're sort of forced to take this route because that's the only thing we understand. No, you know, any supernatural hypothesis, essentially, we have no connection with the supernatural world in order to understand what exactly happens and how that works and so on. All right, so if we look at this chart we used before of the degree of intervention, we already don't expect to see any intervention in the way things work at this moment in time. But again, we cannot rule out the possibility that there was some kind of intervention in making it possible for the universe to develop to the present state. So at some point in the past, it's possible that the universe would not have come to exist where it is in the way it is today, unless there was some external interference that made it happen, or brought it along, or contributed to it becoming what it is today. But when we study that possibility, the only way we can study is by coming up with naturalistic hypothesis, because that's the only thing we understand. So essentially, if we were going to deal with the supernatural, so let's just say we approach things from the perspective that, you know, yes, there is a possibility that God is involved. So given any specific question, the reason that issue exists is because of natural causes or because of supernatural causes. And let's say both were a possibility, we wouldn't be able to study the supernatural side of it. But what we could do is we study the natural side, and we would come up with naturalistic hypothesis. We would make predictions. We would do research and data collection, and then we would decide if those predictions are confirmed. If they are confirmed, we go back and we do more research and we collect more data, and we see if it continues to be confirmed. And the more we follow this loop, the higher our confidence increases that our hypothesis is correct. If, however, the predictions do not confirm the hypothesis, then we have to go back to the beginning, and we have to pick a different naturalistic hypothesis and study that out and follow the same process. And following this logic, The only way we would ever get to a supernatural possibility is if we went through this process enough times that we dismissed all the naturalistic options. And then by sheer elimination, we say, okay, this can never have happened naturally, so it must have happened supernaturally. The problem is in real life, we never quite get there because we would always say, okay, well, we can't think of any naturalistic explanation, but maybe in 100 years or another 1,000 years, as science progresses, maybe then we will come up with a natural explanation and this thing would still be natural. So theoretically, you could deal with the supernatural by eliminating all the naturalistic hypothesis, but in practice that would almost never happen because you would always allow for the possibility that, at some time in the future, you might come up with another naturalistic hypothesis. So essentially, even if there was divine interference in the development of the universe at some stage, it would be very hard for the scientific process to work with that possibility. And the only way it would be able to do it is by some kind of elimination process like this that can hardly actually work in real life, because we would never know for sure that we've tested all the possible natural hypotheses. So this is an area where there's an inherent bias in the scientific process. And it's a bias that's there, that's unavoidable, because the natural world is the only thing we understand, and naturalistic hypotheses are the only things that we could actually make predictions on and test out in most situations. There are some situations, like if somebody says, okay, there was this supernatural flood 6,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago that destroyed the whole world, even though that's a supernatural hypothesis, it has natural implications that we can test out, and we could just confirm that, yeah, there was a flood or there wasn't a flood. But when it comes to how the universe developed over time, we don't actually know how that would happen supernaturally. The only thing we can do is guess how it would happen naturally. And that's the only thing we can test out. And because of that, there is this intrinsic bias, because there's two possibilities. Something could be natural, some element in the development of the universe could be natural, or it could be supernatural. And yet we're always focusing so much on the natural side and more or less ignoring the supernatural. And there's also the possibility that as we're cycling through naturalistic hypotheses, we would come up to a naturalistic hypothesis that seems to work, and then it takes us centuries, decades, centuries, or longer to realize that it doesn't actually work. So for that entire time, we have a false positive. Okay, so I have this analogy here, and it's kind of a crude and not, I always feel like it's not fully an appropriate analogy, but at the same time, people can really relate to it. And this is a situation, imagine a situation where there's some country in the world that is very prejudiced, and it has multiple ethnic groups, and one ethnic group is kind of predominant over the others. And the situation in this country is that anytime a crime is committed, the police are not allowed to investigate people from that specific dominant ethnic group. They can only investigate everybody else. So the idea is, well, okay, if those other people didn't commit the crime and it was committed by somebody from the dominant ethnic group, the police should be able to investigate and look at a bunch of suspects, and then eventually eliminate those suspects by saying, hey, there's no evidence that they did it. And even though they cannot catch who actually did the crime, at least a person who didn't do the crime wouldn't be falsely punished. But in real life, that never actually happens, because, as you're looking at a bunch of suspects, even though they didn't actually commit the crime, there's always a possibility that it would seem as if they committed the crime. So you might end up arresting putting somebody in jail who didn't commit the crime, because all your investigation is focused on one side and never looking at the other ethnic group. If you were allowed to investigate everybody equally, then you could always say, hey, there's more evidence that this person did it versus the other. But because you can't, and the fact that your investigation always focuses on one side, you're liable to make mistakes, and you're liable to have people who are innocent go to jail. So this is kind of the situation here. There's an intrinsic bias because the focus of science is always on the natural side, while eliminating the possibility of a supernatural interference. Now, to this issue, the atheists will say, well, hey, the supernatural is highly unlikely to begin with, so who cares? Because of their whole epistemic misconceptions. While the theists will dismiss this often as well because of their dualism, because in their mind, there's a confusion between what's natural and supernatural, because everything is supernatural. In other words, everything that happens in nature has a natural basis and a supernatural basis because of that dualistic mentality. So it's hard for them to separate the two, and they don't stop to think that science doesn't think about things in that sense. In the scientific logic, the world is treated as natural to begin with, and that's how the whole thing works. So it's always assumed that the reason, they come up with a hypothesis and they make predictions because they view the world as natural, and that gives them the ability to make predictions. They wouldn't be able to make those predictions and to test predictions if they thought there was some supernatural layer to reality, because you wouldn't know how reality would react because of that, and you wouldn't be able to make those predictions. So the only way to really understand the flaw here in this, or the bias here in this logic, and again, remember, I'm saying that this bias is unavoidable, and it's a lesser bias than any other bias we can have. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm just confronting the reality that there's an inherent bias in the process. And it's something that you have to recognize by, taking a break from, I'm speaking to the Christian side or the theist side here. For those that in their mind view the world and view reality as dualistic, you have to interrupt that mental paradigm for a bit and think of this the way the scientist thinks of it, and the inner logic of scientists, how they do their work, because in their mind there is no dualism to the world, and that's why their methodology works. If you insist on having that dualistic element, then this process wouldn't actually be working the way it's supposed to. So there's no reason to take the conclusions of scientists seriously, because they haven't considered the dualistic element in their process. So anyway, I hope that makes sense to at least some people, because a lot of time theists don't fully flesh out the implications of the scientific method and how that lines up with their own metaphysical constructs that they usually think through. Okay, so just kind of recapping everything we said. In science, we always come up with naturalistic hypotheses. If those hypotheses are confirmed, we continue the experiments. If they're not, we come up with other, again, naturalistic hypotheses. We don't ever stop and say, okay, how about we try a supernaturalistic hypothesis for this particular thing? And again, just to give an example, one of my go-to examples here is abiogenesis. Okay, this is something separate from evolution. Abiogenesis has to do with how the first living cells came to exist. How did we go from non-living matter to living matter? And I use this example just because scientists haven't fully explained this component yet. This is still something that's kind of under discussion. It's something that is still being studied. And so because of that, there's a possibility here. It happened naturally, or it happened through supernatural intervention. But the only way scientists can address that question is by assuming it happened naturally and testing out different scenarios. And there's a possibility that at some point they're going to come up with a scenario and it could give them a false positive because it didn't actually happen, and so on. Basically everything I've said so far. Okay, so this process can give false positives, and sometimes it could take us a long time to realize that those approaches don't work. Even if we kind of hit a brick wall and we say, hey, we've tried a bunch of natural explanations and nothing seems to work, all we do is just put the matter on hold, and we say, okay, we're going to revisit this in 100 years. We're going to revisit this in 500 years. By that time, hopefully science will advance and we might be able to come up with better solutions and address the situation naturally. So we always tend to look at things from the natural perspective without really considering the possibility of the supernatural. And then there's also another element that I haven't really addressed, and that is the element of models in science. Scientists like to use scientific models. And a way to think of the model is, imagine a super complicated puzzle with thousands and thousands of pieces, and then you lost the box, so you don't know what the puzzle looks like. All you have is a bunch of pieces, and they're really tiny, and you could look at them all you want, and you cannot really guess what the puzzle is about. So you start building the puzzle, and after somehow managing to connect several dozen pieces, it's starting to look like something. So maybe it's starting to look like a bicycle, right? Maybe you're noticing that you're building like a part of a tire of a bicycle. Okay. Once you understand that, then that becomes a model for you to work with, because once you have a model in your mind, you say, okay, I think what I'm building here is a bicycle, then it kind of guides the next things you do. It makes the next steps easier, because now you're looking for pieces that can complete the tire, and it could complete the bicycle, and you have a direction in your process. You're aiming towards something, whereas before you had no idea what you were building, and it was really hard. So there are advantages to having a model, of having some kind of frame in which you're doing your science, but the model also can put you into a kind of a rut, and sometimes can mislead you. So for example, let's say you're building this little bicycle, but and in your mind you're thinking, okay, maybe this is a puzzle of like a bicycle, somebody riding a bicycle and going somewhere, where in fact maybe this bicycle was on the top of a car and the person is driving a car somewhere. But because you're working with this model of a bicycle, you're not expecting the car, you're expecting to see more bicycles, because you're thinking maybe this is some kind of bicycle race. So sometimes models in science are very helpful, but even models can sometimes bias your science, and it can kind of push you in the wrong direction if your model is incomplete, and if it turns out that you haven't picked the perfect model. And this is well understood. I mean, in most science classes, people talk about how throughout history, different mental paradigms, different visions of reality have shifted as science progressed. So like even in the philosophy of science, we have people like Thomas Kuhn, who talked about how science goes from one paradigm to another over time. And essentially, like, okay, the go-to example is usually with physics. Like you go from Aristotelian physics to Newtonian physics, and then Einstein comes along, and then we have quantum physics. So things kind of shift, moving from one paradigm to another over time. But within this idea of a model, there's benefits to it, and there's also the possibility of bias. And this is fairly well understood in science, but it is there, and it's worth mentioning. Now, when you have something like the theory of evolution, that itself is a model. The theory itself is basically bringing together many different pieces into kind of one complete puzzle of what happened. So I have this illustration here of many different components that come together and they form something. That's kind of how the theory of evolution is, because you have geology, you have paleontology, you have genetics, you have biology, you have a bunch of different fields, all contributing different components to the theory of evolution. But those components are not necessarily equally confirmed scientifically. So if we go back to that graph I had before, where any given question in science, the more it is studied, the more confident you are in its validity. So over time, like if the sample size increases and you get more results, and you could be more and more confident. Well, in the theory of evolution, because it is a model of a lot of interconnected parts, some of those parts are very well confirmed, while other parts are less well confirmed, and there's different levels of confidence people have in the different components of the model. But because they're all tied together into one model, it kind of gives legitimacy to everything. So people say, well, evolution is a fact. Well, which part of it? All of it? There's different components might or might not have the same level of confidence, but they seem to gain legitimacy because of they're part of this bigger model. So it has kind of an omnibus or rider bill effect in politics, where um, you know, they kind of string multiple things together and they pass it all at once, and something might get through that they don't, you wouldn't want, that wouldn't have gone through on its own, but it goes through when it's part of a bundle. So there's that element as well within this idea of working with models in science that also contributes to the overall possibility of bias. But like I've said, in there, because of the nature of the issue of the natural and the supernatural, there is this inherent bias in the scientific process, and it's essentially unavoidable. It's there and needs to be acknowledged, but because of different biases that scientists seem to have when it comes to how they think about reality, and because of their philosophical biases that they bring to the table, they don't always seem to recognize this bias in science. But at the same time, a lot of atheists, for example, they use the success of science, as we mentioned before, as evidence against the existence of God, without acknowledging the fact that there's an intrinsic bias in science that will seem to will indicate or will give the impression that the world is more naturalistic than it actually is, because it always has the possibility of this false positives. So anyway, these are some of the things that we need to think about and consider when we think about the scientific methodology and the implications for and how those implications interact with the possibility of the existence of God, the existence of some kind of supernatural, and things like that.